Imagine this. You're finally recovering from a medical procedure, maybe still a little groggy, but certainly relieved. Then this thick envelope arrives.
Oh, boy.
You tear it open, and the number staring back at you. It's just utterly baffling. Tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands, for something you were sure was covered, or at least, wouldn't cost more than a new car, or maybe even a house. That feeling of shock, frustration, and utter helplessness. That's kind of our entry point for today's deep dive.
It really is. And it's a scenario that's just far too common for millions across the U.S., and it's precisely why we're taking a magnifying glass to the, unique and often bewildering American healthcare system.
Yeah.
We're drawing heavily from Elisabeth Rosenthal's phenomenal book, American Sickness, and as you'll soon discover, that title is incredibly apt.
It really is.
Our mission today is to unearth why healthcare costs in the U.S. are just so astronomically high, often yielding, believe it or not, worse outcomes than in other developed nations. It's this paradox that drives so much of the anxiety and confusion you just described.
And it is a profound paradox. I mean, we're talking about a country that funnels nearly 20% of its entire GDP into healthcare. Over $3 trillion annually.
It's staggering.
To put that in perspective, that's double the average of other developed countries.
Yeah.
Yet, despite this incredible investment, our health outcomes across so many metrics, they frequently fall behind those nations, spending half as much.
Yeah.
On the surface, it makes absolutely no sense.
Absolutely not. And what's truly fascinating is that the book uses an analogy that perfectly encapsulates this market dysfunction, highlighting just how different the U.S. system is from, pretty much everywhere else.
Okay.
Imagine, if you will, buying a plane ticket. You get one bill, right, for your flight.
Simple enough.
But in the world of American healthcare, it's often as if, after you land, you receive not one, but separate bills from the airline, the pilot, the co-pilot, maybe even the flight attendants.
Wow.
You might choose a hospital that's in your insurance network, you do your due diligence, only to get a surprise bill from an out-of-network anesthesiologist you never even saw. This is a system where the whole process of seeing a doctor, getting a procedure, filling a prescription, it's fragmented, it's opaque, and it leaves you, the patient, to piece together this incredibly confusing financial puzzle.
That analogy just perfectly sets the stage for what we're about to explore, because this isn't like random chaos, is it?
No, not at all.
There are underlying, deeply ingrained economic rules that govern this, abnormal market. Elisabeth Rosenthal outlines 10 of them, and we'll be weaving them throughout our discussion today, showing you how they manifest in very real, often painful scenarios.
Exactly.
Just to give you a taste, some of these rules include things like treating more often means better results, most expensive option is the default, or lifelong treatment is preferred over a one-time cure, which is wow. And maybe most jarringly, as technology matures, prices rise instead of fall.
It defies basic economics.
It really does. It's truly a world turned upside down.
Indeed. And by the end of this deep dive, you, our listener, you'll be armed with a clearer understanding of this incredibly complex system, its different players, how they interact, the whole process.
Yeah.
Our hope is really to empower you with the knowledge to not only navigate it better for yourself and your loved ones, but also to equip you to advocate for the crucial changes that are so desperately needed. So let's unpack this thing.
Let's do it. Let's start by digging into the very origins of this problem, because the American healthcare system didn't just, wake up one day and decide to be this way.
Right.
The book posits a really stark truth right off the bat. Decades ago, our system stopped focusing on health or even science. It became almost entirely preoccupied with its own financial interests.
That's exactly right. And the author, Elisabeth Rosenthal, she brings this unique and incredibly credible perspective to this whole discussion.
She does.
Before she penned American Sickness, she spent years as a medical doctor training at prestigious places like New York Presbyterian Hospital. But then she transitioned into journalism, becoming a medical reporter for the New York Times.
Right, that dual background is key.
It is. It means she understands both the clinical realities of medicine and the intricate financial mechanisms that have come to dominate it. Her investigative work, she literally dug through financial reports, tax statements, medical bills for months. It underpins the disturbing findings in this book.
And her conclusion is pretty damning, right?
It is. She concludes that our treatment protocols are no longer dictated by scientific necessity, but by commercial logic. They operate within this deeply flawed market where the default option is almost always the most expensive, and every single incentive pushes for more. More tests, more procedures, more spending.
Okay, so to truly grasp how we got here, let's step into what the book calls the insurance era. And to illustrate just how warped things have become, we have to start with a truly shocking anecdote. It involves a man named Jeffrey Huey.
Ah, yes, Jeffrey Huey. He was a chemistry teacher in New York, a guy with a PhD who suffered from psoriatic arthritis, a really debilitating condition where his immune system would attack his skin and joints.
Right.
For about 15 years, he'd been receiving this highly effective intravenous infusion called Remicade at Beth Israel Hospital. Now, the cost per infusion was already a staggering $19,000.
Wow. Even then.
Even then. But as a New York City employee, his generous Emblem health insurance covered it entirely. He had no out-of-pocket costs, and the drug worked wonders, allowed him to live a normal, active life.
Okay, so far so good despite the high sticker price.
Yeah.
But then things changed.
They did. In 2013, his rheumatologist moved her practice just a few blocks north to NYU Langone Medical Center. She promised, better services, a more academic environment, and for Mr. Huey, more convenient infusion slots, evenings, weekends.
Okay. Sounds reasonable.
And he was initially impressed by the high-end amenities, created by a concierge, taken to a private infusion bay with Wi-Fi, TV, bottled water, snacks, the works.
Right, the hotel experience we hear about.
Exactly. He thought the price would be only a little bit more. And this right here connects to one of Rosenthal's core rules, Rule 3. Equipment and marketing often become more important than good medical care. That plush environment implies higher quality, right? And it helps justify a higher price in the patient's mind.
But it wasn't just a little bit more, was it?
Oh, not even close. That's where the story takes a sharp turn into the absurd. The bills NYU sent to his insurance company were, well, truly staggering. For his first 3-hour infusion in May at this new, swanky hospital, the charge was nearly $99,000.
$99,000 for one infusion.
For one. The next month, it jumped to over $110,000. And by July, it hit an unbelievable $132,791.04.
Get out of here. For the exact same treatment, same drug, same dose, same doctor.
Exactly the same treatment, dosage, and prescribing doctor. A 40% jump in just 3 months.
That's inexplicable.
Yeah.
What was NYU's justification?
Well, when Mr. Huey dared to question it, NYU's billing office offered this flurry of excuses. Transportation costs, storage fees, administrative overhead for the facility. She even told him he shouldn't care how much his insurance was being charged because he wasn't paying out of pocket.
Wow. That's incredibly dismissive.
Right. And it gets even more disturbing. When Rosenthal herself investigated, she found that an independent drug researcher confirmed the wholesale price for that dose of Remicade was only around $1,200.
$1,200 versus over $130,000.
Exactly. And the revelation was that Remicade represented a significant financial interest for NYU Langone. One of the drug's inventors, Dr. Jan Vilcek, who taught at NYU, had donated his share of the patent. NYU later sold most of its rights for a huge sum, but kept a stake if the drug's profits exceeded some undisclosed cap.
Oh.
At over $132,000 per infusion, you can bet that cap was almost certainly being exceeded, meaning NYU was directly profiting from these absolutely exorbitant charges.
Yeah. Okay, but here's the truly infuriating part for me. What did the insurance company, Emblem Health, do? Did they fight this?
You'd think so, right? But no. Instead of disputing this outrageous price, Emblem Health paid most of it. For that first infusion, they shelled out nearly $74,000.
$74,000. They just paid it.
They just paid it. Mr. Huey was outraged, obviously. He saw that they were essentially subsidizing this crazy pricing with taxpayer money, given he was a city employee.
And this directly illustrates Rule 10, doesn't it? Prices rise to whatever the market can bear.
Perfectly. When insurers willingly pay these wildly inflated prices, they're not protecting us, the consumers, or the taxpayers. They're effectively setting a new, higher benchmark that everyone eventually pays for through higher premiums.
It's the definition of a broken market. Their willingness to pay just drove the costs even higher.
Exactly. It got so bad that Huey actually switched to a less effective home injectable drug just because he couldn't stomach being part of such a dysfunctional system anymore.
Wow. That anecdote just perfectly sets up how health insurance, which, as you said, began with benevolent intentions, just morphed into this powerful, self-serving entity.
Right. And it's important to remember, health insurance is a relatively new invention, really only about a century old. Its initial goals were surprisingly altruistic, simply to help the sick.
Yeah, the book traces this history. Early models were pretty simple. Like in the 1890s, a logging company in Tacoma, Washington, paid 2 doctors 50 cents a month per worker to provide medical services.
Right, very basic prepayment.
Then, in 1929, Baylor University Medical Center in Dallas created what became the prototype for modern insurance. Teachers paid just $6 a year, 50 cents a month for 21 days of free hospitalization.
Which was a huge benefit back then.
Huge. The value of that $5 a day is like 105 size a day in 2016 dollars. This was truly a major illness policy, right?
Yeah.
Designed to protect people from financial ruin from a severe health crisis.
Exactly. And within a decade, this model spread nationwide, becoming the Blue Cross plan by 1939. Crucially, it was nonprofit.
Nonprofit, yeah.
It accepted everyone, regardless of age or illness, and charged uniform rates. Blue Cross and its partner, Blue Shield, which covered doctor visits, became incredibly trusted brands.
And then after World War II, with fixed wages, companies started offering health insurance as a perk, right? And it was tax-exempt, which really fueled its growth.
It did. But this major medical insurance was still truly intended for economic disaster, not really to make everyday care cheap or free.
But then the game changed. For-profit insurers like Aetna and Cigna jumped into the market.
And they weren't constrained by that charitable mission of the two Blues, Blue Cross and Blue Shield.
Right.
They could cherry pick. They focused on young, healthy individuals who were less likely to file expensive claims, and they aggressively took market share, chipping away at the foundation of those mission-driven nonprofits.
So the inevitable happened.
The inevitable happened in 1994. Under immense financial strain, many Blue Cross Blue Shield companies were forced to convert to for-profit entities. Emblem Health in New York, the insurer that paid those outrageous Remicade bills for Mr. Kiwi, they were one of them.
Oh, yeah.
Their primary obligation shifted dramatically. It went from patients and communities to their shareholders. Their executives' compensation became tied to financial market performance, not patient outcomes or community health.
And here's where it gets truly perverse, right? With the Affordable Care Act, the ACA, it tried to rein in insurance company profits by mandating that 80% to 85% of premiums had to be spent on actual medical care.
Right, which sounds good on paper. Medicare, by comparison, spends about 98% of its premiums directly on care. So this was seen as a victory for consumers.
But there was an unintended consequence.
A huge one. It created this bizarre, counterintuitive incentive. If you're an insurance company required to spend, say, 85% of your revenue on medical care and your profit is derived from the remaining 15%, what happens when the total cost of care goes up?
Your 15% slices of a bigger pie, so you make more money.
Exactly. Your 15% profit becomes a larger absolute amount. So instead of fighting tooth and nail for lower costs, insurance companies are actually perversely incentivized to let the total cost of care increase.
Because that allows them to collect more premiums,
increase their profits,
and then pass those higher premiums on to consumers the next year. Wow.
It's this vicious cycle where a larger cake means a larger slice for them, regardless of actual savings or value for the consumer.
So it's just an illusion of savings then, when they send you that statement saying, we saved you X amount.
Precisely. Insurance companies love to tout how much they saved you. Cigna, for example, might show a nearly $100,000 hospital bill reduced to $68,000 paid, with you only owing a few thousand.
Right. Look good.
But it's based on an initial price that was already absurdly inflated. They're not truly saving you money in a functional market sense. They're just negotiating down an inflated price that only exists because of this dysfunctional market in the first place.
And this dynamic, the spread of health insurance, the shift to profit, it just created this domino effect, right?
Absolutely. Hospitals, doctors, pharmaceutical companies, they all adapted. They started chasing the money. And as the book powerfully states, the chase for money began. No one was left to protect the patient.
Wow, no one is left to protect the patient. That sentiment just rings so painfully true as we move into the next era we need to unpack. The hospital era. For so many of us, hospitals are, supposed to be these temples of healing, places of last resort. But in the U.S., they've transformed into these hubs of massive profit.
It's a stark transformation. And let's explore another deeply troubling personal story, the case of Heather Pierce Campbell.
Okay.
In 2014, Heather Pierce Campbell, who's a lawyer, was a patient at Swedish Medical Center in Seattle. It's a hospital where she'd actually given birth before.
Okay, so familiar territory.
Right. She went in for a routine prenatal checkup, but a sonogram revealed an ectopic pregnancy, a really dangerous, potentially fatal complication. Within hours, Mrs. Campbell was in surgery, where doctors removed the affected fallopian tube and part of her uterus.
A serious, urgent procedure. How long was she in the hospital?
Less than a day.
Less than a day. Okay.
So imagine her shock when she received a hospital bill for nearly $45,000.
$45,000 for less than 24 hours.
Yep. And even more astonishing, the entire procedure was vaguely labeled just miscellaneous.
Miscellaneous for 45 grand.
Exactly. This was particularly jarring because just a few years prior, she had had a C-section at the same hospital, which included a 2-day stay, and that bill was only $25,000.
Okay, so something's way off here. Did she question it?
Oh, she was furious. She demanded an itemized bill only to be told, quote, "We don't usually provide that."
What? You have a right to an itemized bill.
Absolutely. And as a lawyer, she knew that. She insisted, citing her legal right to it, but the hospital refused to send it and eventually threatened debt collection.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
It just speaks volumes about the lack of transparency in hospital billing, doesn't it? Especially in the U.S. system.
It really was. And her experience is far from unique. Hospital service charges have seen this meteoric rise, right? Up 149% from 1997 to 2012, vastly outpacing doctor fees.
Wow.
In 2013, the average daily inpatient care in a U.S. hospital was $4,300. That's 3 times more than in Australia and 10 times more than in Spain.
So why? Why are hospitals so expensive here?
Well, as one former health official puts it, quoting the notorious bank robber Willie Sutton, because that's where the money is.
Right.
Market economists often call hospitals sharks or money vacuums because despite, limited market forces to regulate their behavior, they can effectively charge whatever they want. And this connects directly to Rule 7. Economies of scale don't lead to lower prices. Large providers demand more.
And most are nonprofit, right? So where does all that money go?
Exactly. Most hospitals are nonprofit, meaning they aren't accountable to shareholders. But their high revenues often fund exorbitant executive salaries, fancy Zen gardens, marble lobbies, not necessarily better patient care or lower costs.
Huh.
A veteran financial executive who's worked extensively with U.S. hospitals described the sector flat out as an extractive industry, where every single point is a profit center. Consultants, billing and collection agencies, even bankers, they all take a cut. It's a system designed to maximize revenue at every single turn.
So how did this happen? How did these charitable institutions transform?
To really understand this, the book takes us on a journey through the evolution of one specific institution, Providence Portland Medical Center in Oregon. Its story is really representative of hundreds of hospitals across America.
Okay.
Providence, like many hospitals, started as a religious charity back in the 1850s, founded by nuns focused on providing care to the poor. You still see lots of hospitals with religious names today, right? Baptist, Mercy, St. Jude, reflecting those philanthropic origins.
Yeah, definitely. So when did that charitable focus start to erode?
Well, it began to erode in the 1960s with the advent of Medicare, and then even more so between 1968 and 1980 when private insurance coverage really peaked. Because patients weren't paying directly anymore, hospitals found they could inflate their service charges.
Ah, the third-party payer effect.
Exactly. They shifted from simple weekly billing to these itemized charges for every single thing, every aspirin, every bandage. Nobody, not even the doctors or nurses, really knew what an appendectomy cost the hospital. But it didn't matter because insurance companies would just pay whatever was billed.
The golden age of billing, as the book calls it.
That's it. And as all this money poured in, hospitals needed more business-minded people to manage it. The number of administrators effectively doubled within a decade.
Wow.
By the early 1980s, hospital management teams, often packed with people holding business degrees, began to reevaluate the core values. They added things like resource management to traditional guiding principles like respect and compassion.
So the bottom line started creeping into the mission statement.
Pretty much. As one pediatrician, Dr. Frank McCullough, who worked at Providence, put it, they paid more attention to the bottom line than to medical tradition.
And then came the professional coders.
Yep. Hospitals started hiring these professional coders whose entire job was to translate doctors' findings into the highest possible revenue bills. Physicians even started getting monthly reports showing how much revenue their treatments generated compared to their colleagues.
Oh, creating internal competition based on revenue.
Exactly. Some doctors grew concerned about overbilling. They tried to get detailed billing records, but the hospital refused.
And then hospitals started changing their relationship with doctors, too.
Right. By the late 1990s, many hospitals stopped paying salaries to emergency room and outpatient doctors. Instead, they made them independent contractors.
Which forced the doctors to negotiate profit-sharing deals.
Precisely. Hospitals also began these aggressive marketing campaigns, boasting about their specialized stroke centers and heart care, building lavish new facilities with marble columns and fountains. Dr. McCullough cynically called his workplace the Providence Marriott Hotel, feeling kind of ashamed treating poor families in such opulent surroundings.
And this drive for profit also fueled consolidation, right? Mergers and acquisitions.
Huge consolidation. Providence merged with many smaller hospitals and doctor practices, growing into one of the largest nonprofit health systems in the U.S., boasting billions in profit and assets. Its president earned millions a year.
And that consolidation gives them even more market power to demand higher prices from insurers. Rule 7 again?
Absolutely. A striking example of this impact is Providence's acquisition of Swedish Medical Center in Seattle. That's where Heather Piers Campbell had her ectopic pregnancy surgery. This affiliation led to changes in Swedish's medical and financial practices, and that incredibly high, vague bill Mrs. Campbell received. That may very well be a consequence of this new consolidated financial power.
So it's clear hospitals weren't just passively reacting, they were actively inventing new business models.
Absolutely. New executive roles like chief medical officers or CMOs emerged. These were doctors, yes, but their primary mission was executive to leverage their influence to turn doctor practices into profit centers. Their focus was on efficiency.
Which translates to?
Things like reducing length of stay, pushing generic drugs, rigorously tracking costs, all about the bottom line.
Now, Medicare tried to control costs with diagnosis-related groups, DRGs, right? Paying a fixed amount per diagnosis.
They did, starting in the mid-1980s, and it did incentivize faster, more efficient treatment within Medicare. But most commercial insurers never fully adopted this fixed payment model.
So that created a gap.
A massive price chasm between the billed amount, the sticker price, and what insurance companies actually paid. Hospitals quickly realized they could charge smaller insurers and, crucially, uninsured patients significantly more if the powerful insurers weren't going to pay the full sticker price anyway.
Which brings us to Rule 8. No fixed prices for procedures or tests. Uninsured pay the most.
Exactly. And then hospitals turned to consulting firms like Deloitte for strategic pricing advice.
Strategic pricing. Sounds ominous.
It kind of is.
Yeah.
These consultants would literally analyze a hospital's master price list, the charge master, this huge list of every possible charge, and advise them to stop charging for small, unbillable items like gauze, but to dramatically increase charges for things considered profit centers.
Like what?
Like surgery time, oxygen, drugs administered in the hospital. The goal was pure revenue maximization from every single billable item. As one former consultant admitted, it was legally sound, but morally questionable, and absolutely increased overall healthcare costs.
And the examples of this absurd billing are just legendary, aren't they?
Oh, they're legion, and frankly, unbelievable sometimes. The $17 Tylenol pill is a classic.
Right.
One case involved a father pronounced dead in the ER lobby after having a heart attack at home. He was billed $21,000 for no services rendered.
That's obscene. And it just vividly showcases Rule 9. No billing standards, anything and everything can be charged.
Absolutely. Another uniquely American phenomenon that popped up is the facility fee.
Yes, the facility fee. Explain that.
Hospitals now charge a separate fee just for the use of their space and equipment, even for outpatient procedures performed in a doctor's office that might be affiliated with the hospital system.
So even if you're not admitted?
Even if you're not admitted. For example, a simple bursa injection that might cost a doctor $80 in his private independent office could suddenly be billed for $5,000 at a hospital-affiliated surgery center, largely due to this facility fee.
It's an extra charge you just won't find in any other country's healthcare system.
Or even in other U.S. industries. It's specific to healthcare here.
And this intense focus on profit-led hospitals to start shedding services that weren't profitable.
Exactly. They began closing unprofitable departments, even if they were traditionally central to their community mission or federally subsidized. Think emergency rooms in poor communities, maternity wards, dialysis units, those were on the chopping block.
And instead, they invested heavily in
highly profitable areas: orthopedics, cardiac care, stroke centers, which mean lots of expensive scans, and oncology, where infusions of incredibly expensive drugs bring in huge profits. Bariatric surgery is another big one.
Right. And what about things like proton beam therapy?
A prime example. This is highly specialized radiation therapy. The machines cost over $100 million each.
Wow.
And there's very little evidence that it's superior to much cheaper alternatives for most common cancers. Yet, because Medicare initially offered generous reimbursement, it led to this huge oversupply.
Yeah.
By 2018, Washington state had 3 of these machines. The entire country of Canada had only 1.
So that's rule 1 in action. More treatment, often better. The most expensive option is the default.
Textbook case.
This transformation even extended to medical training, didn't it?
It did. Hospitals receive about $15 billion annually in government subsidies from Medicare just for graduate medical education training interns and residents.
Okay, so they get paid to train doctors.
Right. Yet they often use these interns as incredibly cheap labor, working them for grueling 36-hour shifts sometimes. While hospitals spend maybe $135,000 per full-time intern on salary and benefits, the federal subsidy alone is around $100,000.
So they're already almost breaking even just on the subsidy.
And researchers estimate each intern creates over $230,000 in value annually through the work they do. So hospitals profit handsomely, even without the subsidies.
Which explains why, even though Medicare tried to cap the number of subsidized training slots back in '97.
The total number of interns still rose significantly, particularly in already well-staffed, often higher-paying specialties. Hospitals lobby hard to maintain those subsidies and access to cheap labor.
And then there's the whole hotel-hospital phenomenon.
Oh, yeah. Gone are the days of basic shared hospital rooms. Today's hospitals increasingly resemble luxury hotels. Private rooms are now the norm, often with no real medical justification, but guess what? Patients get charged a private room surcharge.
Of course.
Valet parking, crystal chandeliers, granite countertops. These amenities are about attracting paying customers, attracting doctors who bring in paying customers, not necessarily improving core patient outcomes.
And the executive salaries reflect this, right?
Absolutely. Hospital CEOs now earn millions, often more than university presidents or heads of major foundations. And their pay is explicitly tied to things like financials, quality, profit, admissions, and net asset growth. Not medical outcomes like reducing hospital-acquired infections or preventing readmissions.
It's just such a bitter irony that the most profitable nonprofit industry is supposedly hospital charity.
Isn't it? Nonprofit hospitals receive enormous tax exemptions, billions annually. Property taxes, payroll taxes, the ability to issue tax-exempt bonds.
And in return, they're supposed to provide charity care and community benefit.
Supposed to. But many spend significantly less on actual charity care than they receive in tax breaks. A 2014 study by California nurses found this massive gap. 3/4 of the hospitals they looked at received more in tax breaks than they spent on community benefits.
And they don't call their profits profits, do they?
No, it's called operating surplus,
Yeah.
which makes it really hard for charity evaluators to properly rate them.
Are there ways to push back on this?
There are some glimmers of hope. In 2001, San Francisco passed an ordinance requiring hospitals to justify their charity care when proposing new, big projects. This gave the city leverage.
Okay.
So when Sutter Health wanted to build a huge new flagship hospital, they had to agree to over $1 billion in community benefits. Things like keeping a struggling safety net hospital open, creating medical innovation funds, funding affordable housing, and even capping insurance price increases for city employees.
Wow. So cities can demand more if they have the leverage.
They can. It shows that these nonprofit giants can be held more accountable.
Okay. And finally, under this hospital era, we have to touch on observation status. This sounds like some kind of financial purgatory.
It really can be. While traditionally it was a legitimate medical tool to monitor patients before deciding on admission or discharge, it's become a major financial loophole for hospitals.
How does it work?
By classifying a patient as under observation, they're technically considered an outpatient, even if they're in a hospital bed for days. This allows hospitals to charge more for certain things and, crucially, avoid readmission penalties from Medicare if a formally admitted patient bounces back within 30 days.
So the hospital benefits, but what about the patient?
The burden falls squarely on the patient.
Yeah.
Because it falls under outpatient insurance rules, patients often face significantly higher copays, typically 20% of the total bill, which can be huge.
Right.
Jim Silly, a software engineer who experienced a brief fainting spell, was put under observation status. His insurance negotiated his $12,000 bill down, but because he was only observed, not admitted, he was still on the hook for a $2,300 copay.
Ouch. And did they even tell you you're under observation?
Well, hospitals are now required to inform patients if they're under observation for more than 24 hours. But this often happens after the fact, leaving patients feeling helpless and trapped in a system that just seems designed to extract maximum revenue at every turn.
Okay, so that's the hospitals. Now, as we transition into what the book calls the doctor era, we encounter another really fundamental shift, the redefinition of the healer as an entrepreneur.
Yeah, it's a striking transformation. And it starts with looking at something as seemingly sacred as the American College of Surgeons oath.
How did that change?
Well, Dr. Michael Canning, a general surgeon mentioned in the book, shared his official oath from 1990. It was beautifully printed, faux parchment, and it included lines like, "I pledge to charge my patients according to the service provided." And crucially, "I will not participate in any arrangements for referral or treatment that are not in the patient's best interest, such as fee splitting or itinerant surgery." Pretty clear ethical lines.
Right. So what happened?
By 2004, the revised oath had simply removed those explicit ethical constraints. The American Medical Association's ethical guidelines also softened over time. They used to state that fees should be equal to the service provided and the patient's ability to pay.
The ability to pay part
Was removed in the 1980s. This shift in ethical language really reflects a deeper, more troubling reality. How much a doctor's labor is valued has been radically redefined.
And U.S. doctors are paid significantly more than elsewhere, right?
Significantly more, especially specialists. A general practitioner in the U.S. earns maybe 40% more than in Germany. An orthopedist earns more than double.
And the book makes the point that the highest earners aren't necessarily the ones working the hardest or with the most training.
But the ones who are savvy about the business of medicine, it's astonishing. Something like 27% of U.S. doctors are in the top 1% of U.S. earners. That's a higher proportion than lawyers or managers, and their salaries have risen steadily since 2009.
Now, medical school's expensive. There's significant debt.
Absolutely. Average debt around $170,000 isn't uncommon. But these high salaries make that debt quite manageable. You see new doctors buying million-dollar homes right out of training.
Yet there's this martyr complex sometimes.
Yeah, the book touches on that. Many doctors genuinely feel overworked and underpaid compared to other high earners, like finance executives, despite their very privileged financial position overall. This perspective often misses the historical context of how doctors' fees evolved from that tradition of charging based on ability to pay.
Right, you mentioned that earlier. Doctors used to be comfortable, middle class, maybe accepting gifts.
Exactly. Wine, chocolates, maybe some artwork. But widespread insurance, especially after World War II, and then Medicare Part B in the 60s and 70s covering doctor fees, that ushered in the fee-for-service system.
And that led to the golden age of doctor billing in the 80s.
It did. For years, insurers, including Medicare, paid based on usual and customary fees, basically, local averages,
Which created a perverse incentive.
for doctors to constantly inflate their prices. If only 5 doctors in a zip code did a certain procedure, the usual fee was just the average of whatever they charged.
Leading to crazy price variations.
Absolutely absurd variations. The book mentions a gallbladder surgery costing $2,000 in Queens, New York, but $25,000 in Nassau County, just 20 miles away, simply because there were more private practitioners driving up the average.
That's Rule 6 perfectly. More competitors don't mean lower prices, they drive prices up.
Textbook. So by 1992, Medicare tried to introduce some order with the relative value unit, or RVU, system.
Okay, what's that?
It aimed to quantify the actual value of doctor services based on factors like work, time involved, overhead costs, training required, and malpractice insurance costs. These RVUs are then multiplied by a conversion factor to determine the payment.
Sounds scientific in theory.
In theory. But it proved highly manipulable. Surgeons and proceduralists, doctors who do things rather than just think, often gain financially, while cognitive specialties like neurologists, who might spend a long time diagnosing complex conditions, often lost out. Success became less about clinical skill and more about understanding and gaming the RVU system.
Okay, so with that context, let's dive into the specific strategies doctors now use to maximize their income, according to the book.
Right. Strategy 1. The doctor entrepreneur owner. This really took off with outpatient surgical centers, or ASCs, starting in the 1980s.
These are the clinics often owned by the doctors themselves.
Exactly, owned by individual doctors or investor groups. They allow doctors to perform procedures outside the hospital and charge a separate facility fee just for using the room where the surgery happens.
So doctors started diverting procedures from their regular offices.
Precisely. They'd move minor procedures, things they could have done in the office, to their own ASCs to capture these much higher facility fees. The book mentions a podiatrist, Dr. Michael Zapp, who is basically offering 100% ROI to other doctors to invest in his ASCs.
Wow.
A simple bunionectomy that might cost $3,000–$4,000 at a regular hospital could be billed for $40–$50,000 at an out-of-network ASC owned by the surgeon. The financial incentive is just enormous.
Okay, what's strategy 2?
Strategy 2. Invisible doctors and mysterious bills. These are the specialists who often have no direct contact with the patient. Pathologists looking at tissues, anesthesiologists during surgery, radiologists reading scans, ER doctors you might barely see.
Right. They used to be hospital employees, generally.
Historically, yes. Their services were just part of the overall hospital bill, but many formed their own LLCs, becoming corporate contractors selling their services back to the hospitals. And crucially, these groups often decided not to join insurance networks. They went out of network.
Leading to surprise bills.
Exactly. Lee Shafir, who we mentioned had great federal insurance, got a $10,000 bill from an out-of-network neonatology group for her baby's NICU stay. Patients think they chose an in-network hospital, they did everything right, and then they get blindsided by these huge, unexpected charges from providers they never chose or even saw.
Oh, okay. Strategy 3.
Strategy 3. Doctors make the rules. Emergency care and exclusive contracts. This ties into a law called EMTALA from 1986. It forced hospitals to treat all emergency room patients regardless of their ability to pay.
Okay, that sounds like a good thing.
It was intended to be, but EMTALA didn't bind the doctors, so hospitals faced a problem. If a critically injured, uninsured patient came into the ER who would actually treat them, the specialists weren't obligated.
I see the dilemma.
So hospitals started signing exclusive contracts with specialist groups, neurosurgeons, orthopedic surgeons, etc. In exchange for agreeing to provide emergency coverage 24/7, these specialist groups got the exclusive right to bill all patients, including the fully insured ones, essentially whatever they wanted for those emergency services.
Because it's an emergency, the prices aren't negotiated beforehand.
Exactly. Olga Becker's daughter, for example, needed emergency brain tumor surgery. She received a staggering $97,000 bill from an out-of-network subcontractor neurosurgeon who allegedly wasn't even specialized in brain tumors. The emergency designation basically justified this enormous non-negotiated bill.
Just incredible. What's strategy 4?
Strategy 4. One doctor, two prices, physician extenders. This is where doctors supervise physician extenders. Think nurse practitioners, NPs, physician assistants, PAs, certified registered nurse anesthetists, CRNAs, and then bill for the work those extenders do as if the doctor performed it themselves.
So the doctor gets paid as if they were in 2 places at once.
Or 3, or 4, or more. It allows a single doctor to bill for work happening in multiple rooms simultaneously. A dermatologist might be overseeing biopsies performed by PAs in 2 or 3 different rooms. An anesthesiologist might be supervising CRNAs in 4 to 6 operating rooms at the same time. Robert Jordan, a diplomat mentioned in the book, got an anesthesia bill for $2,000–$3,000. The anesthesia was actually administered by a nurse anesthetist, but a passing anesthesiologist who was technically supervising also billed the same amount.
So double billing for the same service, effectively.
Often, yes. Medicare sometimes catches this, but commercial insurers are often less vigilant. This supervision model is a big reason why anesthesiologists have become among the highest paid doctors. Despite often not performing the complex work directly, they might literally be supervising from a lounge nearby.
And their lobby fights hard against letting nurse anesthetists practice independently.
Very hard. They cite safety concerns, even though research generally suggests that independent practice by CRNAs is safe. It's largely about protecting their billing model.
Strategy 5 sounds intriguing. Selling goods, buy and bill.
Ah, yes, buy and bill.
Yeah.
This is where doctors purchase drugs at wholesale prices, administer them in their offices, and then bill insurance companies at much higher inflated rates, pocketing the difference, the spread.
So they become drug retailers, essentially.
Pretty much. A notorious historical example is TAP Pharmaceuticals' Lupron, a prostate cancer drug from the 1980s. TAP gave doctors huge discounts, even free samples, which the doctors could then turn around and bill insurance for at full price if they administered it in their offices.
That sounds like a kickback.
It basically was. Some doctors reportedly earned hundreds of thousands of dollars a year just from the profit margin on Lupron. TAP was eventually fined $885 million for what prosecutors called a national conspiracy.
Wow. Is this still common?
Yes, buy and bill is especially prevalent in oncology. Cancer doctors often profit significantly from dispensing expensive chemotherapy drugs directly in their offices or infusion centers they own. The more expensive the drug, the higher the dollar amount of their percentage markup.
Creating a clear financial incentive that might conflict with the best interest of the patient.
Absolutely. It directly influences prescribing patterns, and it ties into Rule 5. No freedom of choice. Patients are stuck buying whatever their doctor stocks and recommends.
Okay, strategy 6, upgrades, elective procedures.
Right. As medical technology improved, making procedures like cataract surgery much safer and faster, Medicare reimbursement rates actually decreased because less work was involved.
So doctors needed to make up the revenue.
Exactly. They responded by upgrading patients to more expensive, often medically unnecessary options. Barbara Benning, for example, paid an extra $4,000 per eye out of pocket for a laser and special lens option during her cataract surgery. There was no clear medical necessity for the upgrade, and Medicare didn't cover it.
That's rule 3 again. Equipment and marketing are more important than good medical care.
Textbook. Similarly, when LASIK eye surgery became less popular, ophthalmologists started pushing toric lenses for astigmatism correction during cataract surgery as luxury or business class upgrades. They buy these lenses for maybe under $500 and sell the upgrade to the patient for around $670.
Just pure upselling.
Pure upselling, often driven by manufacturer marketing, encouraging doctors to frame it as a premium choice. Femtosecond lasers for cataract surgery, costing $500,000 each with little evidence of better outcomes, are another example, primarily used to justify these upgrade fees.
And the last one, strategy 7, vascular surgery money. Money everywhere. This highlights specialty blurring.
Yes, this is a fascinating and troubling example. It involves nephrologists, kidney doctors performing complex vascular access procedures, specifically creating fistulas for dialysis patients. These procedures were traditionally done by highly trained vascular surgeons.
So doctors doing procedures outside their core training.
Exactly. The book profiles Dr. Florin Gatorin, a nephrologist with minimal surgical training who earned over $2 million just from Medicare billings in 2012 by performing these lucrative vascular procedures in his rather humble, half-empty office clinic.
$2 million for Medicare alone.
Yes. It showcases Rule 1 again. More treatment, often better. The most expensive option is the default. But it also highlights a critical systemic issue. Once a doctor is licensed, they can often practice largely as they wish, performing new procedures even if they lack the specialized training required, especially if those procedures pay well.
Leading to potentially unqualified individuals performing complex surgeries.
It's a major concern, and all these strategies, while clearly maximizing income for many doctors, lead to this rather sad conclusion the book touches on, the risk of losing the traditional patient-focused doctor.
Right, the Dr. Mallas of the world.
Exactly. People like Dr. Robert Mallow in the Bronx, who still charges maybe $82 per visit, hasn't invested in all these profit-generating side businesses like labs or ASCs, and hasn't sold his practice to a big hospital system. He represents an ideal, a way of practicing medicine that is just increasingly difficult to sustain in this incredibly profit-driven environment.
Which brings us inevitably to what might be the most contentious and frankly opaque corner of this American healthcare beast, the pharmaceutical era.
Ah, yes. The Wild West of drug pricing, as one economist aptly described it.
Let's start with another patient's story. Hope Marcus and her absolute nightmare with a very common drug.
Hope Marcus suffered from ulcerative colitis, a chronic inflammatory bowel disease. For decades, she relied on a drug called mesalamine. It's an old, generally inexpensive drug that worked well for her.
Okay, so what happened?
Well, as the patent for the specific 400 milligram Asacol tablet she was taking neared expiry in 2013, a company called Warner Chilcott bought the rights to it. And what did they do immediately? They introduced new, improved versions. Asacol HD and Delzacol.
New and improved how?
Barely. They were essentially just recoded versions of the old drug, but crucially, this minor tweak allowed them to get new patent protection. And then they stopped producing the original version.
Forcing patients to switch. That's product hopping.
Textbook product hopping. Marcus was forced onto the new, much more expensive drug. The price quickly jumped to around $800 a month, then $1,200 a month. And patients were complaining they found the new pills harder to swallow, sometimes even passing them intact, meaning they weren't even working properly.
So she's paying massively more for a potentially less effective drug.
Exactly. She got so desperate she started resorting to ordering generic mesalamine from India via a Canadian pharmacy for just $55 a month, even though she was worried about the legality of it.
Wow. But the price saga wasn't over.
Not even close. In 2015, the price of her generic mesalamine suppository from a different delivery method inexplicably jumped overnight from $167 to $700. Meanwhile, the brand name version of that suppository exceeded $1,200.
That's just Mind-blowing. It perfectly illustrates Rule 4, right? As technology matures, prices rise instead of fall. And Rule 6, more competitors don't mean lower prices, they drive prices up.
Absolutely. It defies all normal market logic. And just for comparison, the book notes that in the UK, the same drug costs just £40, maybe $55 full price, or only £9, about $12, if you got it through the National Health Service.
The disparity is just enormous, and the industry claims to be highly competitive.
Right. The pharmaceutical industry's powerful trade group, VHRMA, always talks about competition. But the mesalamine case shows that competition in this market often means companies just trying to gain market share for their specific, often marginally different branded products, rather than focusing on true innovation or actually lowering costs for patients. It's not competition in a way that benefits consumers.
How did we get to this wild west of pricing?
Well, historically, pharma companies were smaller, selling things like tonics with unstable profits. Early regulations, like the Wiley Act of 1906, focused on safety and purity, making sure the bottle contained what it said it did and wasn't poisonous, but not efficacy, not whether it actually worked.
Right. Then came the 1938 Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act.
Prompted by a terrible disaster where over 100 people, mostly children, died from an untested sulfanilamide elixir that used a toxic solvent. That act finally required safety testing before a drug could go to market.
And then the big one, the Kefauver-Harris Amendment in 1962.
Spurred by the thalidomide tragedy, where a supposedly safe sleeping pill caused severe birth defects, this amendment finally required drug companies to prove efficacy, too, that their drugs actually work for what they claimed.
But here's the crucial missed opportunity, isn't it?
It really is. During all these early regulatory reforms focused on safety and efficacy, Congress completely missed the chance to address costs, cost effectiveness, or comparative effectiveness.
Which are standards used by pretty much every other developed nation.
Exactly. They use those standards when deciding which drugs to approve for their national health systems and how much to pay for them. But the FDA's approval standards in the U.S. never considered price or value for money.
And that oversight, combined with changes in patent law,
laid the groundwork for today's pricing chaos. Historically, drug inventors often didn't even seek patents. Jonas Salk famously asked, "Could you patent the sun?" when asked about patenting his polio vaccine. It was seen as a public good.
But that changed
dramatically. The 1980 Bayh-Dole Act was a game changer. It allowed universities and companies to patent inventions that came from federally funded research. Suddenly, the incentive was there to patent everything.
And the idea of one drug, one patent disappeared.
Completely. Drugs now have multiple patents, sometimes 5, 10, 15, or even more, protecting not just the core chemical formula, but also things like specific dosage forms, delivery systems, methods of manufacturing, anything they can think of to extend their monopoly.
Then the Hatch-Waxman Act in 1984 tried to balance things.
It was intended to balance rewarding innovation with encouraging generic competition. It created pathways for generics, but also gave brand name companies ways to extend their patents and fight off generic entry. Unfortunately, it unintentionally ignited this explosion of patent protection strategies and litigation.
Which leads us back to Professor Schondelmeyer calling it the Wild West.
Exactly. He says the market has truly broken. And because the U.S. has this robust patent system and, crucially, no government price controls like other countries, global pharma companies shifted their focus here. By 2002, something like 82% of global pharma R&D investment was happening in the U.S.
Because they knew they could charge whatever they wanted here.
Precisely. U.S. pharma growth has been double the overall economy since 1990. And the leadership at these companies changed too. CEOs became pure business people, often from finance backgrounds, focused on maximizing shareholder value and capital markets, rather than scientists primarily interested in developing cures for the public good.
Enter Martin Shkreli.
The poster child for this new mentality, right? A former hedge fund manager who bought the rights to an old off-patent generic drug for a parasitic infection, Daraprim, and immediately raised the price overnight from $13.50 a pill to $750 a pill, just because he could.
So how did policy changes further enable these strategies? The HIV crisis was a catalyst.
A major one. The urgent need for AIDS treatments in the 80s changed drug approval and pricing norms forever. AZT, the first major AIDS drug, was approved in 1987 based on minimal clinical trial data due to immense public pressure.
And its price was shocking at the time.
Astonishingly expensive, as the book says, $8,040 per year back then. This success and the high prices that followed for combination therapies set a dangerous precedent for charging premium prices, especially for serious diseases.
This era also saw the FDA relax rules around surrogate endpoints.
Yes. Instead of requiring proof that a drug extended survival or improved quality of life, the FDA started allowing approvals based on substitute measures, things like showing improvement in a blood marker or shrinking a tumor on a scan, even if that didn't translate to patients actually living longer or feeling better.
Which speeds up approvals,
but leads to many drugs getting to market with questionable real-world benefit. The book cites studies showing that a staggering 74% of oncology drugs approved via these surrogate endpoints in the last decade didn't actually extend patient life by a single day, yet they command incredibly high prices.
And then came direct-to-consumer advertising. Ask your doctor if drug X is right for you.
Oh, yeah. First allowed in the early 90s, but it exploded after FDA guidelines were relaxed in 1997. Spending on these DTC ads just skyrocketed from maybe $166 million in 1993 to $4.2 billion by 2005.
Billions spent marketing drugs directly to patients.
Billions. Merck's painkiller Vioxx is a famous example. They spent $160 million on ads in 2000 alone. That's more than Budweiser or Nike spent. Before, of course, Vioxx was pulled from the market after being linked to tens of thousands of heart attacks.
And the U.S. and New Zealand are the only countries that allow this.
The only two developed nations. It basically turns medical decisions into marketing opportunities, driving demand for the newest, most expensive, and often not necessarily best drugs.
The non-24 sleep disorder campaign is another wild example of this.
Absolutely wild. You might have seen those TV ads, often aired late at night, featuring blind people talking about this rare sleep disorder called non-24-hour sleep-wake disorder, which affects maybe 100,000 totally blind Americans.
Okay.
Now, Dr. Robert Sack, a respected sleep researcher, had found way back in 2000 that plain old melatonin, a cheap, unpatentable natural supplement, was actually quite effective for managing this condition.
Melatonin cost pennies.
Exactly. But then Vanda Pharmaceuticals developed tasamelteon, a chemically similar but crucially patentable drug they called Hetlioz.
And the FDA approved it.
Approved it in 2014, even though the data showed it was really no better than melatonin. Dr. Sack was actually on the FDA approval committee and said he felt really uncomfortable because the FDA standards, remember, don't consider cost or allow a comparison to existing cheaper treatments like melatonin.
So what did Vanda price Hetlioz at?
Get this, $96,000 a year. That's about $267 per dose, compared to maybe $6 for 100 melatonin pills.
$96,000 versus $6 for basically the same effect.
It's unbelievable. Vanda exploited the rules for accelerated approval for rare diseases using small, short trials and those surrogate endpoints. Then they marketed it heavily to this niche group of blind people while also starting trials to get it approved for the much larger, more lucrative jet lag market.
Just pure market manipulation.
Okay.
So let's get into the specific patent game strategies pharma uses to keep prices high.
Right. One of the most insidious is litigation, specifically pay-for-delay schemes.
How does that work?
When a generic company files to market a version of a brand name drug, the brand name company almost automatically sues them for patent infringement. This lawsuit triggers an automatic 30-month delay in the generic's approval.
Okay, so that buys them time.
But then they go a step further. The brand name company often pays the generic company millions of dollars to settle the lawsuit and agree to delay their market entry even longer, sometimes for years.
They pay their competitor not to compete.
Exactly. It's blatantly anti-competitive, costs consumers and the healthcare system billions every year by keeping cheaper generics off the market. But it's often legal or settles in a gray area. Sanofi, maker of the blockbuster insulin Lantus, which saw huge price hikes just before its patent expired, sued Eli Lilly over its biosimilar version. They eventually settled, delaying Lilly's competing product from entering the market.
Unbelievable. Okay, what else? Product hopping we covered with mesalamine.
Well, right. Formulation changes or product hopping. They're changing a capsule to a tablet to a chewable, adding a new coating. Anything to get a new patent and force patients to switch from the old version, which generics could then copy, to the new patent-protected one. Warner-Chilcott did this repeatedly with an acne drug called Dorix capsule, then tablet, then dissolvable, then a scored tablet, each change bringing new patents and blocking generics.
They also exploit FDA weaknesses.
Definitely. exploiting FDA weaknesses and blind spots. For instance, certain drug formulations, think sprays, lotions, creams, inhalers, are technically much harder for generic companies to replicate exactly to the FDA's strict standards compared to simple pills. This complexity inherently keeps generics off the market longer.
Ah, interesting.
Another loophole came from an FDA decision in 2006 to crack down on very old drugs that had somehow never gone through the formal approval process but had been used safely for decades.
Okay.
Companies saw an opportunity. They took these ancient, cheap drugs, ran some basic tests to get formal FDA approval and market exclusivity, and then jacked up the prices astronomically. Colchicine, a gout drug used for hundreds of years, costing pennies a pill, became Colchris. It got 5 patents and suddenly cost $5 per pill in the U.S. while still costing 9 cents in Canada.
Turning pennies into dollars by exploiting a regulatory update. Wow.
And there's the over-the-counter OTC conversion strategy. This one's really clever.
How does this one work?
Under U.S. law, a drug generally can't be both a prescription drug and an OTC drug with the same active ingredient at the same time. So when a brand name company decides to take its prescription drug, OTC, any existing generic versions of the prescription strength usually have to cease production.
Kicking the generics off the market.
Exactly. And the brand name company gets 3 years of market exclusivity for its new OTC version. GSK did this masterfully with its popular nasal steroid spray, Flonase. They converted it to OTC, forcing the prescription generics off the shelves, then priced the OTC version high, around $40 a bottle.
But they didn't stop there.
Oh, no. Simultaneously, they launched a new prescription nasal spray, fluticasone furoate, Baramist, with just a slight chemical tweak from the original Flonase. This got them brand new patent protection, allowing them to continue profiting heavily from both the high-priced OTC version and a new patented prescription version. It's brilliant financial engineering.
Truly gaming the system. What about combining drugs?
Right. Compounding or fixed-dose combinations, often called evergreening. This involves taking 2 or more old, cheap, generic drugs and combining them into one new, expensive, patented pill.
Like a 2-for-1, but way more expensive.
Exactly. Take Duexis, a painkiller. It simply combines generic ibuprofen and generic famotidine, an acid reducer like Pepcid. Bought separately, those generics might cost $9 a month each.
Okay, so what does Duexis cost?
Over $1,600 a month. Protected by 5 patents, Horizon Pharma deployed a huge sales force, 160 reps, just to push this combination pill onto doctors. And they even settled a lawsuit with a generic company to keep it off the market until 2023. It's pure profit generation, zero medical innovation.
So all these tactics lead to sky-high drug prices, which then leads to high copays for patients.
Right. As drug prices soared into the thousands per month, insurance companies reacted by imposing higher percentage-based copays, trying to steer patients for cheaper alternatives. But when the drug costs $5,000 a month, even a 20% copay is $1,000 a month, completely unaffordable for most people.
Putting essential medications out of reach.
Exactly. So pharma invented their solution: copay assistance or patient assistance programs.
Which sound helpful, but...
But it's really a unique form of self-serving corporate charity. Pharma companies provide money, often through third-party foundations they heavily fund, to cover the patient's copay.
Why do they do that?
Because it allows the drug company to continue billing the insurance company for the full inflated price of the drug. If the patient couldn't afford the copay, the pharmacy wouldn't fill the prescription and the drug company would get nothing. By covering the copay, they ensure they get the remaining 80% or 90% from the insurer, which is still a massive amount.
So it keeps the patient on the expensive drug and keeps the money flowing to pharma.
Precisely. Mary Chapman, who battles MS, saw her monthly drug costs jump from $1,200 to $5,000 for the same class of drugs over the years. Her copays became thousands annually. She had to rely on these patient assistance foundations, like the Patient Access Network, PANN, to cover those copays.
And these foundations are largely funded by pharma itself.
Overwhelmingly. It's a clever way to effectively subsidize patient costs without directly giving money to doctors or patients, which would violate anti-kickback laws. This whole system keeps patients dependent on expensive drugs they otherwise couldn't afford, allows pharma to maintain incredibly high prices, shields them from price pressure, and ultimately costs the entire healthcare system and all of us through premiums enormous sums of money.
And we can't talk about drug prices without mentioning the middlemen, right?
Yeah.
PBMs.
Ah, yes. The hidden middlemen. Pharmacy benefit managers, or PBMs. Companies like Express Scripts, CVS Caremark, Optimark. These are huge, powerful, for-profit intermediaries hired by employers and insurance companies to manage prescription drug benefits and supposedly negotiate lower prices with pharmacies and drug makers.
Supposedly, but how do they actually make money?
They have immense market power because they control access to millions of patients. They primarily profit by keeping a portion of the discounts or rebates they negotiate with drug manufacturers. The bigger the rebate they negotiate, the more they might keep.
So they're incentivized to favor drugs with high list prices and high rebates.
Often, yes. Their formularies, the lists of drugs they agree to cover for an insurance plan, are frequently based on which drugs offer the best profit margin for the PBM, not necessarily which drug is the most clinically effective or the lowest net cost for the patient or the plan sponsor.
Can you give an example?
A stark example was when Express Scripts, one of the largest PBMs, suddenly dropped several popular, expensive asthma inhalers like Advair from its main formulary. This forced millions of patients to switch medications, causing considerable disruption. But guess what? Express Scripts' quarterly profit jumped 16% shortly after. Their decisions directly impact patient access and boost their bottom line.
And a final, really troubling consequence of this whole Wild West system is the disappearance of some essential generic drugs.
Yeah, the vanishing generics. Starting in the early 21st century, we began seeing persistent shortages of crucial, cheap, often injectable generic drugs used in hospitals. Things like basic antibiotics, anesthetics, drugs for nausea like prochlorperazine used in ERs.
Why would cheap essential drugs disappear?
Often because the profit margins became too thin for manufacturers to bother making them, especially with complex FDA regulations around sterile injectables. But the consequence is that hospitals are then forced to use newer, much more expensive, often still branded alternatives.
Like the nausea drug example.
Right. Instead of the old generic prochlorperazine costing maybe $4 a dose, hospitals might be forced to use something like Zuplems, a branded dissolvable film form of ondansetron, costing $1,300 for just a few doses. It drives up costs unnecessarily for both patients and the entire system, all because the basic, cheap options aren't reliably available anymore.
So, as we bring this deep dive to a close, let's try to sum up what we've uncovered here. The American healthcare system, as Elisabeth Rosenthal paints it in American Sickness, it's just fundamentally transformed, hasn't it?
It really has. It's no longer primarily about health or science. It's evolved into this incredibly complex, profit-driven industry where financial incentives and frankly, business acumen often override patient well-being and just plain common sense.
And each major player, we've talked about the insurers, the hospitals, the doctors, the pharmaceutical companies, they've all found these increasingly sophisticated ways to maximize their own revenue.
Often at the direct expense of the patient or the taxpayer footing the bill. And it really highlights how drastically different the process and the priorities are compared to how healthcare systems operate in most other developed nations.
And it really comes back to those 10 economic rules of an abnormal healthcare market that the book lays out. They explain so much of the dysfunction.
They really do. From the default always being the most expensive option, to prices actually rising as technology matures, to more competitors somehow driving prices up, not down. This isn't a market where Adam Smith's invisible hand leads to efficiency or affordability.
No, it feels more like the invisible hand is firmly placed on the cash register.
That's a perfect way to put it. It's a system where almost every transaction, every decision point, every new technology seems engineered, or at least incentivized, to extract as much money as the market can possibly bear, regardless of value.
But knowing these mechanisms, understanding these rules and strategies, that's the first step.
It's the crucial first step. It empowers you, the listener, to start asking better questions, to scrutinize those bewildering bills, to understand the often hidden forces at play in your own healthcare journey. It's really about becoming a more informed and active participant, not just a passive recipient of services and bills.
Absolutely. As we reflect on this journey through the, frankly, often maddening hidden costs and distorted incentives of American healthcare, maybe consider this provocative thought to leave you with. In a system where that invisible hand is so clearly focused on the cash register, what does it truly mean to seek health and healing? It's a question that really challenges us all to reevaluate the fundamental purpose of our healthcare system and to contemplate what kind of changes, maybe even radical changes, might be necessary to realign it with its original, much more noble mission of caring for people.